In a world where military ranks are earned through blood, sweat, and unwavering determination, one woman's journey from overlooked recruit to commanding officer would challenge everything the Army thought it knew about leadership. This is the true story of Colonel Sarah Mitchell, whose path to command was paved with prejudice, perseverance, and the kind of courage that only emerges when everything you've worked for hangs in the balance. What started as a young woman's dream to serve her country would become a revolution that changed the face of military leadership forever. But first, she had to prove that sometimes the most unlikely candidates make the most extraordinary commanders. The morning sun cast long shadows across the recruitment office parking lot as Sarah Mitchell adjusted her backpack straps for the third time in 5 minutes. At 22, she stood 5 feet 4 inches tall, with determined brown eyes that had watched her father polish his military boots every Sunday morning for 18 years. Today, those same eyes reflected a mixture of excitement and nervous energy as she prepared to follow in his footsteps. The building before her looked more like a corporate office than the gateway to military service. Glass doors reflected her image back at her, showing a young woman in her best interview clothes, hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, posture straight, despite the butterflies dancing in her stomach. She had been preparing for this moment since she was 12 years old, when her father first told her stories about his time serving overseas. Colonel James Mitchell had been a career soldier, spending 32 years climbing the ranks from private to full colonel. Sarah remembered sitting on the living room floor surrounded by his photo albums, listening to tales of camaraderie, purpose, and the honor of serving something greater than oneself. Her mother, Linda, would shake her head and mutter about filling their daughter's head with dangerous ideas, but Sarah had been captivated from the very beginning. The recruitment office doors opened with a soft whoosh of air conditioning, and Sarah found herself in a world of polished floors and motivational posters. Images of soldiers in various scenarios decorated the walls. Some showed men and women working together on complex equipment, others depicted humanitarian missions, and several featured intense training exercises. Each poster carried bold text about honor, courage, and commitment. Behind the reception desk sat Sergeant Rodriguez, a man in his 40s whose uniform was so perfectly pressed it could have cut paper. His name tag gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and his expression was neutral but attentive as Sarah approached. "Good morning," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I have an appointment to discuss enlistment options." Sergeant Rodriguez consulted his computer screen and nodded. "Sarah Mitchell, 9 a.m. appointment. Please take a seat and I'll call you when we're ready." The waiting area contained several other potential recruits, mostly young men who looked like they had stepped out of action movies. They sat with the casual confidence of people who had never doubted their place in the world, discussing workout routines and which military occupational specialties they planned to pursue. Sarah listened quietly, noting how easily they seemed to assume they would be accepted, how naturally they spoke about leadership roles and advancement opportunities. One young man, probably 19 or 20, was explaining to his friend why he planned to become an officer. "My dad says with my college degree and athletic background, I'll probably make lieutenant within a few years. The military needs natural leaders, you know?" His companion nodded enthusiastically. "Same here. I mean, look at us. We're exactly what they're looking for. Strong, smart, ready to take charge. It's guys like us who end up running things." Sarah bit back a smile. Their confidence was admirable, even if it was completely unfounded. She had spent the last 4 years earning a degree in international relations while working part-time jobs to pay for school. Her grades were excellent, her physical fitness scores were in the top 10% of her class, and she had completed 2 internships with defense contractors. But she had learned early in life that accomplishments meant nothing if you couldn't convince others to take you seriously. "Sarah Mitchell?" Sergeant Rodriguez's voice cut through her thoughts. She stood and followed him down a hallway lined with more motivational imagery. The recruitment office proper was a small room with a desk, 2 chairs, and a computer. Rodriguez gestured for her to sit while he settled behind the desk and opened a thick folder. "So, Miss Mitchell, tell me why you want to join the Army," he said, his fingers poised over the keyboard. This was the question Sarah had been preparing for since she decided to enlist. She had practiced her answer in the mirror, refined it based on research about what recruiters wanted to hear, and tested it on her father during their Sunday morning conversations. "I want to serve my country and be part of something that makes a real difference in the world." She began, "I believe the military offers unique opportunities to develop leadership skills while contributing to national security and international stability. I'm particularly interested in positions that would allow me to use my education in international relations while gaining practical experience in complex operational environments." Rodriguez nodded as he typed, his expression giving away nothing. "What about your long-term goals? Are you thinking about this as a short-term commitment or a potential career?" "I'm open to making this a career if the opportunities are there," Sarah replied. "I know advancement is based on performance and merit, and I'm prepared to work hard to prove myself." The sergeant paused in his typing and looked at her directly for the first time. "Miss Mitchell, can I be frank with you?" "Of course. The military is changing, but it's still a challenging environment for women, especially women with leadership aspirations. You seem intelligent and motivated, but you need to understand that you'll face obstacles that your male counterparts won't encounter. Are you prepared for that?" Sarah had expected this conversation. Her father had prepared her for it during their talks, explaining that while official policies had changed dramatically over the years, cultural attitudes often lagged behind. She appreciated Rodriguez's honesty, even if she didn't particularly want to hear it. "I understand there will be challenges," she said carefully. "But I believe that's all the more reason for women who are serious about military careers to step up and prove themselves. Change happens when people are willing to work for it." Rodriguez smiled for the first time since they had started talking. "That's a good attitude. Let's talk about your education and qualifications." The next hour passed quickly as they discussed Sarah's academic background, her physical fitness scores, and her preferences for military occupational specialties. Rodriguez explained the various career paths available to someone with her qualifications, the training requirements for different positions, and the typical timeline for advancement through the ranks. "Based on your education and scores, you'd be eligible for Officer Candidate School," he explained. "That's a challenging program, but it puts you on a faster track for leadership positions." "What kind of leadership positions?" Sarah asked. "Well, that depends on your specialty and performance, but junior officers typically start by leading small units, maybe a platoon of 30 or 40 soldiers. From there, advancement is based on evaluations, additional training, and available positions." Sarah felt a thrill of excitement at the possibility. Leading soldiers, making decisions that mattered, being responsible for mission success, it was exactly what she had dreamed about during those childhood conversations with her father. "I'd definitely be interested in Officer Candidate School," she said. Rodriguez pulled out another set of forms and began explaining the application process. The paperwork was extensive, requiring everything from academic transcripts to character references. Physical fitness tests, medical examinations, and security clearance investigations would follow. The entire process could take several months. "One more thing," Rodriguez said as they finished up. "Officer Candidate School is designed to test your limits. They're going to push you physically and mentally, and they're going to put you in situations where you have to prove you can lead under pressure. Some people who look perfect on paper don't make it through the program." "I understand," Sarah replied. "I'm ready for the challenge." As she left the recruitment office that morning, Sarah felt like she was walking on air. The first step was complete, and she was officially on the path toward becoming an Army officer. She called her father from the parking lot, barely able to contain her excitement as she described the meeting. "Sounds like you made a good impression," Colonel Mitchell said when she finished. "But remember, this is just the beginning. The real work starts when you get to training." Over the following weeks, Sarah threw herself into preparing for the next phase of the process. She increased her workout routine, spending hours each day running, lifting weights, and practicing military-style exercises. She read everything she could find about military leadership, studying the biographies of famous commanders, and analyzing case studies of successful operations. Her mother watched these preparations with a mixture of pride and worry. Linda Mitchell had spent her married life as a military spouse, moving from base to base, managing households while her husband deployed, and raising their daughter largely on her own during his frequent absences. She understood the sacrifices military life demanded, and she worried about her daughter's ability to navigate the challenges ahead. "Are you sure this is what you want?" she asked one evening as Sarah studied leadership manuals at the kitchen table. "I'm sure, Mom," Sarah replied without looking up from her book. "This feels right. It feels like what I'm supposed to be doing." Linda sat down across from her daughter and waited until Sarah looked up. Your father and I are proud of you no matter what you choose to do, but I want you to understand that the military can be a lonely place, especially for women. You'll miss out on a lot of things other people your age take for granted. I know, Sarah said, but I'll also get to be part of something important. I'll get to make a difference. Her mother smiled and reached across the table to squeeze her hand. Then we'll support you every step of the way. The phone call came 3 weeks later. Sarah had passed all the preliminary requirements and was accepted into officer candidate school. Her start date was 8 weeks away, which gave her just enough time to finish the final preparations and say goodbye to civilian life. The night before she left for training, the Mitchell family gathered around the dinner table one last time. Sarah's father had prepared her favorite meal, and her mother had insisted on making a chocolate cake despite Sarah's protests about the extra calories. They talked about everything except the fact that Sarah would be leaving the next morning for 12 weeks of intensive training. After dinner, Colonel Mitchell walked his daughter out to the back porch, where they had shared so many conversations over the years. The evening air was cool and clear, and the stars were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. You know, he said quietly, I always hoped you might choose a different path. Something safer, maybe something that would keep you closer to home. Sarah looked at her father in surprise. This was the first time he had ever expressed reservations about her military ambitions. But watching you prepare for this, he continued, seeing your determination and your commitment to excellence, I know you're going to be an outstanding officer. The Army is lucky to have you, even if some people won't recognize that right away. What if I'm not good enough? Sarah asked, voicing the fear she had been carrying for weeks. Her father turned to face her directly. Sarah, I've watched you tackle every challenge life has thrown at you. You've never backed down from hard work, you've never made excuses when things got difficult, and you've never let other people's expectations limit what you believed you could achieve. You're going to face people who think you don't belong, who assume you can't handle the pressure, who'll be waiting for you to fail. But I know something they don't know. What's that? I know that you have the heart of a leader, not because of your gender, not despite your gender, but because of who you are as a person. You see problems and you solve them. You see people struggling and you help them. You see injustice and you stand up to it. That's not something they can teach in officer candidate school. That's something you either have or you don't. And you have it. The next morning, Sarah stood in her childhood bedroom, looking around at the posters and photographs that had decorated her walls for years, pictures of her with friends, awards from school and sports, books that had shaped her thinking. All of it felt like artifacts from someone else's life. She was about to become someone new, someone she had been working toward becoming for years, but had never actually been before. Her parents drove her to the airport, the car filled with the kind of silence that comes when everyone has too much to say and no idea how to say it. At the departure gate, they hugged longer than usual, holding on to a moment they all knew marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. As her plane lifted off, Sarah pressed her face to the window and watched her hometown grow smaller and smaller below. Somewhere down there were the high school hallways where she had first started thinking seriously about her future, the college classrooms where she had refined her understanding of international relations, and the family home where she had learned about honor, duty, and the importance of serving something greater than yourself. But ahead of her, somewhere beyond the clouds and the horizon, was officer candidate school. 12 weeks of physical and mental challenges designed to transform civilians into military leaders. 12 weeks of proving herself to instructors who had seen hundreds of candidates come and go. 12 weeks of discovering whether all her preparation and determination would be enough to earn the right to call herself an Army officer. The plane banked to the right, and Sarah settled back in her seat. She opened the leadership manual she had brought for the flight and began reading about the principles of military command. Outside her window, the landscape scrolled by, each mile carrying her further from everything familiar and closer to everything she hoped to become. In a few hours, she would arrive at the training base where her real journey would begin. She would meet her fellow candidates, encounter her first military instructors, and take the first steps toward earning the rank and responsibilities she had dreamed about for so long. But for now, suspended between her past and her future, Sarah Mitchell allowed herself to feel the full weight of the moment. She was scared and excited, confident and uncertain, ready for anything and completely unprepared for what lay ahead. She was 22 years old, armed with determination and a dream, about to discover what kind of leader she could become. The plane flew on through the afternoon sky, carrying its passenger toward a destiny that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself, and everything the Army thought it knew about leadership. The bus ride from the airport to the officer candidate school felt like traveling through a time portal. Sarah watched through the window as suburban neighborhoods gave way to military housing, then to training facilities that looked like they belonged in a different century. Chain-link fences topped with razor wire marked the boundaries of a world where everything from the color of the buildings to the width of the sidewalks had been designed with military precision. Fort Benning stretched out before them like a small city built entirely for the purpose of creating soldiers. The candidate school occupied one section of the massive base, a collection of brick buildings arranged around parade grounds, where generations of future officers had learned to march in perfect formation. As the bus pulled up to the reception center, Sarah could see groups of uniformed figures moving with the kind of purposeful stride that seemed to come naturally to people who spent their lives following orders and giving them. The other candidates on the bus represented a cross-section of American ambition. There was David Chen, a recent engineering graduate from MIT, whose parents had immigrated from Taiwan, with dreams of their son becoming a doctor or lawyer. Instead, he had chosen military service as a way to combine his technical skills with his desire to serve his adopted country. Jennifer Walsh sat near the back, a former college basketball player whose athletic scholarship had provided her first opportunity to attend university. She had majored in communications and planned to use her military experience as a stepping stone to a career in international diplomacy. Marcus Thompson had grown up in inner-city Detroit, where military service represented one of the few reliable paths to economic mobility. His high school guidance counselor had encouraged him to consider officer candidate school after he scored in the 95th percentile on standardized tests, while maintaining a perfect attendance record despite working 20 hours a week to help support his family. Now he sat quietly, reviewing notes he had made about military leadership principles, determined to prove that opportunity was all he had ever needed. The bus pulled to a stop in front of a building marked Reception and Processing, and the driver turned to address his passengers. "This is your stop, candidates. Leave your civilian clothes mentality on this bus, because the next 12 weeks are going to change everything about how you think, act, and see the world." As Sarah stepped off the bus, she was immediately struck by the intensity of the environment. Drill sergeants moved among the new arrivals like sharks circling prey, their voices cutting through the afternoon air with commands that brooked no hesitation or confusion. Everything happened at double speed. Formations snapped into place, equipment was distributed and accounted for, and candidates were processed through administrative requirements with assembly line efficiency. "Mitchell, Sarah J." A drill sergeant's voice boomed across the processing area. "Here, drill sergeant," Sarah responded, snapping to attention as she had practiced at home. "You think this is summer camp, candidate Mitchell?" "No, drill sergeant." "You think we're here to make friends and share feelings?" "No, drill sergeant." "Outstanding. Because for the next 12 weeks, we're here to find out if you have what it takes to lead United States soldiers in combat. Some of you do, and some of you don't. Our job is to figure out which category you belong in." The first week of officer candidate school was designed to break down everything candidates thought they knew about themselves. Physical training began before dawn with runs that seemed to get longer each day, followed by calisthenics that pushed everyone to their limits. Academic sessions covered everything from military history to tactical planning, with instructors who expected perfect recall of complex information under pressure. Sarah found herself struggling with aspects of training she had never anticipated. The physical demands were intense but manageable. Her preparation had paid off, and she was able to keep pace with most of her male counterparts. The academic requirements were challenging but familiar, drawing on study skills she had developed during her undergraduate years. What she hadn't prepared for was the constant psychological pressure. Drill instructors seemed to have a supernatural ability to identify each candidate's weaknesses and exploit them ruthlessly. They would wait until someone was exhausted and stressed, then demand split-second decisions that could determine whether the entire unit succeeded or failed in their assigned task. During her third week, Sarah found herself appointed as the leader of a squad tasked with completing a night navigation exercise. The objective seemed straightforward: use map and compass to guide her team through a series of checkpoints in the woods, arriving at the final destination within a specific time window. Simple enough, except that the exercise took place in complete darkness, with equipment that had been deliberately damaged to test the candidate's ability to adapt and overcome obstacles. Her squad consisted of 5 other candidates, including Marcus Thompson and a quiet woman named Angela Rodriguez, who had previously served as an enlisted soldier before applying for officer candidate school. The group also included 2 men who had made it clear from the beginning that they didn't believe women belonged in combat leadership positions. "Mitchell, you sure you can read that compass in the dark?" asked Brian Stevens, a former college football player who seemed to view every training exercise as a personal competition. "Maybe one of us should take point on this." "I've got it, Stevens," Sarah replied evenly, adjusting her equipment and studying the map. She had spent hours practicing land navigation during her preparation, and she was confident in her technical skills. The real challenge would be maintaining her authority as squad leader while managing the group dynamics that threatened to undermine their mission. The exercise began at 2300 hours, with Sarah's squad starting from a designated point and moving through dense woods toward their first checkpoint. Navigation in darkness required constant attention to detail, counting steps, monitoring compass bearings, and identifying terrain features that might not be clearly visible on the map. Every few hundred meters, Sarah would halt the squad to verify their position and adjust their route as necessary. By the second checkpoint, it became clear that Stevens and his friend Jake Morrison were deliberately questioning every decision Sarah made. When she called for a brief halt to confirm their position, Stevens suggested loudly that they were falling behind schedule because of her overcautious leadership style. When she chose a route that avoided a steep ravine, Morrison wondered aloud whether they wouldn't make better time by taking more direct path through difficult terrain. Marcus Thompson and Angela Rodriguez followed Sarah's orders without complaint, but she could sense the tension building within the squad. Military units succeed or fail based on cohesion and trust, and every minute spent dealing with internal dissent was a minute that couldn't be devoted to mission accomplishment. The third checkpoint presented a major navigation challenge. According to the map, they should have found a distinctive rock formation that served as an easy reference point for the next leg of their journey. Instead, they found themselves in an area that looked nothing like what the map indicated. Sarah studied the terrain carefully, comparing what she could see with the contour lines and symbols on her map. "I think we're about 200 meters south of where we should be," she announced to the squad. "We need to adjust our bearing and move northwest to get back on track." "Are you sure about that?" Stevens asked. "Because if you're wrong, we're going to fail this exercise, and that reflects on all of us." Sarah felt a flash of anger at Stevens' tone, but she forced herself to remain calm. Getting into an argument with a subordinate would only make the situation worse, and she still had a mission to complete. "I'm sure," she said firmly. "Angela, take point. Marcus, your rear security. Everyone else, maintain noise discipline and stay alert." The adjustment proved correct, and they reached the 4th checkpoint ahead of schedule. But as they prepared for the final leg of the exercise, Stevens decided to escalate his challenges to Sarah's leadership. "Look, Mitchell, you've done okay so far, but this last section is the most critical. Maybe I should take over from here. I've got more experience with this kind of terrain." Sarah stopped walking and turned to face Stevens directly. The rest of the squad gathered around, sensing that this moment would determine how the exercise and their working relationship would end. "Stevens," Sarah said, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. "That means I make the decisions, and you follow orders. If you have suggestions about tactics or route selection, you can share them during our planning sessions. But questioning my authority in the middle of a mission is not acceptable, and it undermines unit effectiveness." Stevens started to respond, but Angela Rodriguez stepped forward. "She's right, Stevens," Rodriguez said quietly. "I've been on enough operations to know that second-guessing your squad leader in the field gets people killed. Either support her decisions or request a leadership change through proper channels when we get back to base." The confrontation diffused as quickly as it had escalated, but Sarah knew that Stevens would continue to test her authority throughout the training program. She also knew that how she handled these challenges would determine not only her own success but also the success of other women who would follow in her footsteps. The squad reached the final checkpoint with 15 minutes to spare, successfully completing their night navigation exercise. As they waited for transportation back to the base, Sarah allowed herself to feel a moment of satisfaction at their accomplishment, but she also recognized that this was just one small test among many that lay ahead. The following weeks brought increasingly complex challenges. Leadership positions rotated among the candidates, giving everyone experience in both command and subordinate roles. Sarah found herself serving under leaders whose styles ranged from highly collaborative to borderline dictatorial, learning valuable lessons about what worked and what didn't in different situations. During her 4th week, she was assigned to serve as executive officer for a simulated combat mission led by Marcus Thompson. The exercise required their unit to establish a defensive perimeter around a strategic objective while coordinating with air support and artillery units. Marcus proved to be a natural leader, combining clear communication with the ability to make quick decisions under pressure. But the exercise took an unexpected turn when the instructors introduced a series of casualty scenarios designed to test the candidate's ability to maintain mission focus while dealing with wounded soldiers. Within 30 minutes of the exercise beginning, Sarah found herself designated as the senior medical officer for multiple simulated injuries, including one that required immediate evacuation by helicopter. "Mitchell, you've got 3 minutes to establish a landing zone for the medevac chopper," Marcus called out as simulated enemy fire erupted around their position. "Thompson needs immediate evacuation, but we can't compromise our defensive position." Sarah looked around quickly, identifying a clearing about 50 meters from their main position that was large enough for a helicopter landing but far enough away to maintain tactical security. She grabbed 2 other candidates and led them toward the site, calling out instructions as they moved. "Rodriguez, I need you to mark the landing zone with signal panels. Chen, help me move Thompson to the evacuation point. Everyone else, provide covering fire and maintain communication with the incoming aircraft." The exercise continued for another hour, with Sarah managing multiple responsibilities simultaneously while Marcus coordinated the overall defensive operation. When it concluded, the instructors gathered the entire unit for an immediate debriefing session. "Candidate Thompson, your leadership during this exercise was solid. You maintained situational awareness, adapted to changing circumstances, and accomplished your primary mission," the senior instructor announced. "Candidate Mitchell, your performance as executive officer and medical officer was exemplary. You identified solutions quickly, communicated clearly, and never lost focus on the welfare of your soldiers." Sarah felt a surge of pride at the recognition. But she also noticed the expressions on some of her fellow candidates' faces. Stevens and Morrison seemed particularly displeased with her praise, while others appeared genuinely impressed with her performance under pressure. After the debriefing, Angela Rodriguez approached Sarah as they walked back toward their barracks. "You handled that situation really well today," she said. "I've seen a lot of officers freeze up when they have to deal with casualties and tactical operations at the same time." "Thanks," Sarah replied. "Marcus made it easier by keeping the big picture organized. Good leaders make everyone around them better." "That's true," Rodriguez agreed. "But you should know that some of the guys are starting to take notice of your performance. Not all of them are happy about it." Sarah had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed by another candidate made the situation feel more real. She was beginning to understand that success in officer candidate school was about more than just meeting the training standards. She was also being evaluated by her peers, many of whom would eventually serve alongside her as fellow officers. The social dynamics of the program were complex and often unspoken. Candidates formed study groups, workout partnerships, and informal support networks that could make the difference between success and failure. But those same relationships could also become sources of conflict when competition for leadership positions intensified. As the weeks passed, Sarah found herself increasingly isolated from some of her male peers. Stevens and Morrison had convinced several other candidates that Sarah was receiving favorable treatment from the instructors, and that her success came at the expense of more deserving male candidates. The accusations were subtle but persistent, creating an undercurrent of tension that affected everything from meal conversations to training partnerships. The situation reached a breaking point during the 7th week of training, when candidates were required to complete a 3-day field exercise that would count heavily toward their final evaluations. Each candidate would rotate through different leadership positions, with their performance being evaluated not only by instructors but also by their peers. Sarah was assigned to lead a 20-person unit through a complex mission that required them to establish a forward operating base, conduct reconnaissance patrols, and coordinate with simulated local civilian authorities. The exercise was designed to test every aspect of military leadership: tactical planning, resource management, personnel motivation, and crisis decision-making. On the morning of the exercise, as Sarah briefed her unit on their mission objectives, she noticed Stevens exchanging meaningful glances with several other candidates. She had a sinking feeling that her leadership would face challenges that had nothing to do with the official exercise parameters. Her intuition proved correct. Throughout the first day, Stevens and his allies found ways to subtly undermine Sarah's authority, without openly defying orders. They would take slightly longer than necessary to respond to commands, ask unnecessary clarification questions during time-critical situations, and make just enough mistakes to slow down the unit's progress without being obviously insubordinate. By the end of the first day, Sarah's unit was behind schedule and struggling with coordination problems that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The instructors observed everything but said nothing, leaving Sarah to handle the situation on her own. That evening, as the unit established their overnight defensive position, Sarah made a decision that would define her approach to leadership for the rest of her military career. Instead of trying to identify and confront the individuals who were undermining her authority, she decided to address the entire unit about the importance of teamwork and mutual support. Standing in the center of their defensive perimeter, with 20 candidates gathered around her in the fading light, Sarah spoke about leadership in a way that surprised even herself. "I know some of you have questions about my ability to lead this unit," she began, her voice calm but carrying clearly in the still evening air. "Some of you think I don't belong here or that my success somehow diminishes your own achievements. I understand those feelings, because change is always uncomfortable, especially when it challenges assumptions about how things have always been done." She paused, looking around the circle of faces that reflected varying degrees of attention, skepticism, and curiosity. "But here's what I know for certain. Tomorrow, we're going to face challenges that will test every one of us. Our success will depend not on whether you like me or approve of my leadership style, but on whether we can function as a team when the pressure is highest. The enemy we're simulating doesn't care about our personal conflicts or political opinions. They care about exploiting our weaknesses to accomplish their mission." As Sarah let that sink in for a moment before continuing. "So tonight, I'm asking each of you to make a choice. You can spend tomorrow proving that I don't deserve to lead you, and in the process ensure that our entire unit fails this exercise. Or you can spend tomorrow proving that American soldiers can overcome any obstacle when they work together toward a common goal." She looked directly at Stevens as she delivered her final point. "The choice is yours. But remember that your decision will be evaluated not just by the instructors who are watching us, but by the soldiers you'll someday be responsible for leading into combat. They deserve leaders who put mission accomplishment ahead of personal grudges." The camp fell silent except for the distant sounds of other units conducting their own training exercises. Sarah waited for someone to respond, but when no one spoke, she simply nodded and began outlining the next day's operational plan. The second day of the exercise transformed the dynamics of Sarah's unit in ways that surprised everyone, including the instructors who had been prepared to intervene if the leadership challenges became too disruptive. Stevens didn't become Sarah's biggest supporter overnight, but he began following orders promptly and professionally. More importantly, other candidates who had been waiting to see which way the wind would blow began demonstrating the kind of teamwork that made complex military operations possible. By the end of the 3-day exercise, Sarah's unit had not only completed all their assigned objectives, but had done so ahead of schedule and with fewer resources than most of the other units. The instructor's evaluation was unanimously positive, praising both the unit's tactical performance and their demonstration of cohesion under pressure. But Sarah knew that the real victory had been personal. She had discovered that effective leadership wasn't about proving herself to skeptics or winning popularity contests. It was about creating conditions where everyone could succeed, even people who didn't particularly like or respect her. She had learned to lead by example rather than by confrontation, and to focus on mission accomplishment rather than personal vindication. The lessons of that field exercise would stay with Sarah throughout the remaining weeks of officer candidate school and beyond. She had found her voice as a leader, not by becoming louder or more aggressive, but by becoming more confident in her own judgment and more skilled at bringing out the best in the people around her. As the program moved into its final phase, Sarah's reputation among both instructors and fellow candidates shifted dramatically. She was still not universally liked, and there were still people who questioned whether women belonged in combat leadership roles, but no one questioned her competence or her commitment to the mission. Second Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell stood in front of the mirror in her quarters, adjusting the gold bars on her uniform collar for what felt like the 100th time. 3 months had passed since her graduation from Officer Candidate School, and today marked the beginning of her first real assignment as a commissioned officer. Fort Carson stretched out beyond her window, a sprawling military installation that would serve as her introduction to the reality of leading soldiers in peacetime. The promotion ceremony had been everything she had dreamed about during those challenging weeks of training. Her parents had flown in to watch as she took her oath of office, her father beaming with pride as he pinned the lieutenant's bars on her dress uniform. But the celebration had been brief, and now she faced the daunting prospect of proving herself worthy of the trust that had been placed in her. Her assignment was to serve as a platoon leader in the 3rd Infantry Division, commanding 38 soldiers in a mechanized infantry unit. The job description sounded straightforward enough: maintain readiness, conduct training, ensure the welfare of her troops, and prepare for potential deployment. But Sarah was discovering that the reality of military leadership was far more complex than anything Officer Candidate School had taught her. The platoon she inherited had been without permanent leadership for 6 weeks, operating under the temporary command of a senior sergeant who was clearly unhappy about returning to his previous role as platoon sergeant. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez was a 12-year veteran whose experience in Iraq and Afghanistan had earned him the respect of every soldier in the unit. He was also skeptical about taking orders from a 23-year-old college graduate who had never heard a shot fired in anger. "Lieutenant Mitchell," Rodriguez said during their first meeting, his tone respectful but cool. "The men are good soldiers, but they're used to operating a certain way. They've been through a lot together, and they don't warm up to new leadership very quickly." Sarah nodded, recognizing both the information and the warning embedded in Rodriguez's words. She had spent considerable time during her 3 months of follow-on training studying the dynamics of taking over an established unit, and she knew that her success would depend largely on earning the trust of soldiers who had every reason to be suspicious of her. "Tell me about the unit's strengths and challenges," she said, settling into her desk chair and pulling out a notepad. "I want to understand what we're working with." Rodriguez relaxed slightly as he began describing the platoon's capabilities. They were an experienced group, with most soldiers having completed at least 1 deployment overseas. Their technical skills were excellent, and their performance on standardized evaluations consistently ranked in the top 10% of similar units. But morale had been declining over the past year due to a series of leadership changes and the uncertainty about future missions. "The biggest challenge is that these guys have been jerked around too much," Rodriguez explained. "They've had 3 different platoon leaders in the past 18 months, and each one had different priorities and different ways of doing things. They're tired of adjusting to new leadership styles every few months." "What about our current readiness status?" Sarah asked. "Technically, we're green across the board," Rodriguez replied. "Equipment is maintained, training requirements are current, and personnel issues are minimal. But if you asked me whether we're ready to deploy tomorrow, I'd have some concerns." "Such as?" "Unit cohesion. These soldiers can perform individual tasks at a high level, but we haven't functioned as an integrated team in quite a while. Everyone's been focused on meeting minimum standards rather than achieving excellence." Sarah spent the rest of the week observing her new unit in action. She attended their morning physical training sessions, watched them conduct equipment maintenance, and sat in on their weekly training meetings. What she saw confirmed Rodriguez's assessment. They were competent professionals, going through the motions without the sense of purpose and pride that characterized truly effective military units. The soldiers' attitude toward their new platoon leader ranged from cautious optimism to barely concealed skepticism. The younger enlisted personnel seemed willing to give her a chance, while the more experienced soldiers adopted a wait-and-see approach that reminded Sarah of her early days in Officer Candidate School. Corporal James Washington was typical of the unit's veterans. 26 years old with 2 combat deployments behind him, he had been hoping for promotion to sergeant before the platoon's previous leadership changes disrupted the normal advancement process. Now he found himself serving under a lieutenant who was younger than he was and had never been in combat. "No disrespect, Lieutenant," Washington said during one of their first conversations, "but some of us are wondering what you bring to the table that we haven't seen before." It was a fair question, and Sarah had been asking herself the same thing since arriving at Fort Carson. Her military education was extensive but theoretical. Her leadership experience was limited to training exercises where the consequences of failure were academic rather than life and death. What did she offer that justified her authority over soldiers with combat experience and years of practical knowledge? "That's a fair question, Corporal," Sarah replied. "Right now, I bring fresh eyes, new energy, and a commitment to helping this platoon reach its full potential. 6 months from now, I hope I'll bring something more valuable. The experience of having worked alongside all of you to accomplish missions that matter." Washington nodded thoughtfully but didn't look entirely convinced. Sarah knew she would need to demonstrate her value through actions rather than words. Her first test came during a routine training exercise designed to evaluate the platoon's ability to establish and maintain a defensive position. The scenario was straightforward. Occupy a piece of terrain, establish fields of fire, coordinate with adjacent units, and maintain the position for 72 hours while conducting simulated combat operations. Sarah spent considerable time preparing for the exercise, studying the terrain, reviewing tactical manuals, and consulting with Rodriguez about the best approach to positioning her soldiers. She developed a detailed plan that took advantage of natural defensive features while ensuring that her unit could respond effectively to attacks from multiple directions. But when the exercise began, nothing went according to plan. The first problem emerged within hours of occupying their assigned position. Sarah's initial deployment placed 2 of her squads in locations that provided excellent fields of fire, but made resupply and communication extremely difficult. By the end of the first day, those squads were running low on ammunition and water, with no easy way to address the shortage without exposing soldiers to simulated enemy fire. "Lieutenant," Rodriguez said quietly during a brief tactical pause, "we need to adjust our positioning. The squads on the left flank are going to be in serious trouble if this continues." Sarah studied her map and realized that Rodriguez was absolutely correct. Her textbook approach to defensive positioning had failed to account for the practical requirements of sustaining operations over an extended period. She needed to make adjustments, but doing so would require moving soldiers under simulated enemy observation. "What do you recommend?" she asked. "We need to create a covered route between our main position and the left flank," Rodriguez replied. "It's going to require moving some people during darkness, and we'll have to accept some risk. But it's better than leaving those squads isolated." Sarah authorized the adjustment, and the platoon spent the second night repositioning key personnel and establishing better supply routes. The changes worked, but they also revealed another problem. Several of her soldiers had lost confidence in her tactical judgment. The issue came to a head during the third day of the exercise, when Sarah's unit was tasked with conducting an assault on a simulated enemy position. The mission required careful coordination between multiple squads, with precise timing to ensure that supporting fires were effective without endangering friendly forces. As Sarah briefed the assault plan to her squad leaders, she noticed skeptical expressions on several faces. Corporal Washington raised his hand during the briefing. "Lieutenant, are you sure about the timing on this?" he asked. "Because if we're off by even 30 seconds, we're going to have artillery landing on our own people." "The timing is correct, Corporal," Sarah replied, double-checking her calculations. "We'll have a 2-minute window between the end of the artillery barrage and the beginning of our assault." "Ma'am, with respect, that doesn't give us much margin for error," said Sergeant First Class Johnson, the leader of her second squad. "What if the artillery runs long, or what if we encounter unexpected obstacles during our approach?" Sarah felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. These were the same kinds of challenges to her authority that she had faced during officer candidate school, but now they were coming from soldiers whose lives might someday depend on her decisions. The stakes felt infinitely higher. She took a deep breath and looked around at the faces of her squad leaders. These were good soldiers, asking legitimate questions about a plan that would determine their success or failure. They weren't challenging her authority out of spite or prejudice. They were trying to ensure that the mission succeeded and that everyone came home safely. "You're right to ask those questions," she said finally. "Let's adjust the timeline to give ourselves a larger margin for error. We'll wait 3 minutes after the artillery lifts before beginning our assault, and we'll designate alternate routes in case we encounter obstacles during our approach." The modifications proved wise. When the actual assault began, Sarah's unit encountered unexpected resistance that required them to adapt their plan in real time. But because they had built in extra time and alternate approaches, they were able to adjust without compromising the mission or endangering friendly forces. The exercise concluded with Sarah's platoon receiving high marks for tactical proficiency and adaptability. But more importantly, she could sense a subtle shift in her soldiers' attitudes toward her leadership. They were beginning to see her not as an inexperienced officer who needed to be protected from her own mistakes, but as someone who could learn from experience and incorporate their expertise into effective operational planning. The real breakthrough came 3 weeks later during a particularly challenging field training exercise. Sarah's platoon was tasked with conducting a night reconnaissance mission that required them to infiltrate enemy territory, gather intelligence on simulated enemy positions, and extract without being detected. The mission combined many of the most difficult aspects of military operations: movement in darkness, stealth, navigation, and split-second decision-making under pressure. During the planning phase, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of developing the plan in isolation and then briefing it to her subordinates, she called together her most experienced soldiers and asked for their input from the beginning. "I need your expertise on this one," she told the group, which included Rodriguez, Washington, Johnson, and 2 other senior enlisted soldiers. "You've all done this kind of mission for real, and I haven't. I can read the manuals and apply the principles I learned in training, but you know what actually works in the field." What followed was the most productive military planning session Sarah had ever participated in. Her soldiers shared insights about movement techniques, communication procedures, and contingency planning that no textbook had ever covered. They identified potential problems with her initial approach and suggested solutions based on hard-won experience. Lieutenant Washington said during the discussion, "One thing we learned in Afghanistan is that reconnaissance missions succeed or fail based on how well you prepare for things to go wrong. You can have the perfect plan, but if you don't have good backup plans, you're setting yourself up for failure." The collaborative planning process resulted in a mission plan that was far more sophisticated and realistic than anything Sarah could have developed on her own. But more importantly, it created a sense of shared ownership among her soldiers that transformed the way they approached the entire exercise. When the mission began at 0200 hours, Sarah's platoon moved through the darkness with a precision and confidence that impressed even the exercise evaluators. Every soldier understood not just their own role, but how their actions fit into the larger mission. When unexpected challenges arose, and they always did during realistic training exercises, the unit adapted seamlessly because everyone had been involved in developing the contingency plans. The mission was a complete success, with Sarah's platoon gathering all required intelligence and extracting without detection. But the real victory was the way her soldiers had performed as an integrated team rather than a collection of individuals following orders. After the exercise debriefing, Sergeant Rodriguez approached Sarah with something she had never seen from him before: a genuine smile. "Lieutenant," he said, "that was some of the best leadership I've seen in my 12 years in the Army. You took a group of individual soldiers and turned them into a team that can handle anything." "We did that together," Sarah replied. "I just provided the framework." "No, ma'am," Rodriguez said firmly. "You did something that a lot of officers never figure out. You realized that good leadership isn't about proving how smart you are or how much authority you have. It's about making everyone around you better at their job." Over the following months, Sarah's platoon developed a reputation throughout the battalion for excellence in training and high morale. Their performance on standardized evaluations consistently ranked among the best in the division, but what really set them apart was their cohesion and mutual trust. The transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't without its challenges. Sarah made mistakes, sometimes significant ones, and had to learn from them while maintaining her soldiers' confidence in her leadership. She discovered that effective leadership required constant attention to both mission requirements and personnel welfare, balancing competing demands in ways that no textbook could adequately describe. She also learned that her gender, while still occasionally a source of skepticism from soldiers in other units, had become largely irrelevant to the men and women under her command. They evaluated her based on her competence, her fairness, and her commitment to their success. When she demonstrated those qualities consistently, other considerations faded into the background. The most important lesson came during a conversation with one of her soldiers, 6 months after taking command of the platoon. Private First Class Martinez was a 19-year-old from New Mexico who had been struggling with homesickness and uncertainty about his future in the Army. Sarah had been working with him individually to help him develop confidence and find his place within the unit.
"Lieutenant," Martinez said after a particularly successful training exercise, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When you first got here, I wasn't sure you could handle leading us. Not because you're a woman, but because you seemed so young and inexperienced.
But watching you work with all of us over these months, I realized something." "What's that?" "Good leaders aren't the ones who never make mistakes. Good leaders are the ones who care enough about their soldiers to keep trying to get better, even when it's hard." Sarah felt a surge of pride at Martinez's words, but she also recognized the weight of responsibility they represented. Her soldiers had placed their trust in her leadership, and that trust carried obligations that extended far beyond the requirements outlined in any job description. As she reflected on her first year as a commissioned officer, Sarah realized that she had learned as much about herself as she had about military leadership. She had discovered reserves of strength and patience she hadn't known she possessed. She had developed the ability to make difficult decisions under pressure while remaining open to input from people with more experience. Most importantly, she had learned that true leadership wasn't about commanding respect. It was about earning it through consistent demonstration of competence, integrity, and genuine concern for the welfare of the people she led. The Army had given her the authority to lead soldiers, but her soldiers had taught her how to be a leader worth following. That distinction would shape her approach to command for the rest of her military career, informing every decision she made and every relationship she built with the men and women who served under her command. As she prepared for her next assignment, a promotion to first lieutenant, and a new position with greater responsibilities, Sarah carried with her the confidence that came from having succeeded in her first test of military leadership. She had proven to herself and to her soldiers that she belonged in the ranks of commissioned officers, not because of her gender or despite it, but because of her character and competence as a leader. Captain Sarah Mitchell's boots hit the tarmac at Bagram Airfield with a solid thump that seemed to echo the gravity of the moment. After 3 years of stateside assignments and countless training exercises, she was finally stepping onto the soil of Afghanistan, where theoretical leadership principles would be tested against the harsh realities of combat operations. The morning air carried the distinctive scent of dust, aviation fuel, and something else she couldn't quite identify. The smell of a place where young Americans came to discover what they were truly made of. Her promotion to captain had come 18 months earlier, along with assignment as a company executive officer in the 1st Cavalry Division. The position was designed to prepare promising young officers for company command, providing them with experience in logistics, personnel management, and operational planning while serving under the mentorship of experienced commanders. Sarah had excelled in the role, earning the respect of both her superiors and the soldiers she helped lead through increasingly complex training scenarios. But Afghanistan was different from anything she had experienced. Here, mistakes had consequences, measured in blood rather than training scores. Here, the enemy didn't follow the rules of engagement that governed military exercises, and success was defined not by meeting training objectives, but by bringing soldiers home alive. Captain Mike Thompson, her commanding officer, met her at the aircraft as she gathered her gear and prepared for the helicopter ride to their forward operating base. Thompson was a veteran of multiple deployments whose calm demeanor masked the kind of tactical expertise that came only from extensive combat experience. "Welcome to the war, Mitchell," he said with a wry smile. "Hope you're ready to put all that training to good use." The flight to forward operating base Chapman took 30 minutes, during which Sarah pressed her face to the small window and watched the Afghan landscape unfold below. Mountain ranges stretched to the horizon, their peaks still covered with snow despite the approaching summer. Villages nestled in valleys that looked peaceful from the air, but could contain any number of threats. Roads wound through terrain that offered countless opportunities for ambushes and improvised explosive devices. FOB Chapman was a study in controlled chaos. Concrete barriers and razor wire defined its perimeter, while inside the base, soldiers moved with the purposeful urgency of people who understood that their lives depended on constant vigilance. Helicopters came and went at all hours, carrying supplies, personnel, and sometimes wounded soldiers to larger medical facilities. The base hummed with the activity of a military unit operating in enemy territory, where every day brought new challenges and unexpected dangers. Sarah's company was responsible for providing security for convoy operations between Chapman and several smaller outposts scattered throughout the region. It was dangerous work that required them to patrol roads known to be seeded with improvised explosive devices, while remaining alert for ambushes, sniper attacks, and other threats. The company had already lost 3 soldiers during the deployment, with several others wounded seriously enough to require evacuation to medical facilities in Germany. Her first week in country was devoted to understanding the operational environment and building relationships with the soldiers she would be leading into harm's way. These were veterans who had been conducting combat operations for months, and they evaluated new officers based on competence under fire rather than performance in training exercises. Staff Sergeant David Kim was typical of the company's experienced non-commissioned officers. An 8-year veteran with previous deployments to both Iraq and Afghanistan, Kim had learned to spot the differences between officers who could handle combat stress and those who would become liabilities when the shooting started. "Ma'am," he said during one of their first conversations, "the men are going to be watching you pretty carefully during your first few operations. They need to know that you can make good decisions when people are trying to kill you." "I understand," Sarah replied. "What should I expect during my first convoy?" "Expect everything and nothing," Kim said. "Sometimes we drive for 6 hours and nothing happens. Sometimes we don't make it 2 kilometers before we're in a firefight. The key is staying calm and thinking clearly no matter what develops." Sarah's first convoy operation was scheduled for her second week in country. The mission was routine by Afghanistan standards. Escort a supply convoy from Chapman to a smaller outpost about 40 kilometers away, then return with soldiers who had completed their rotation at the remote location. The route was well-traveled but dangerous, passing through several areas where insurgents were known to operate. Captain Thompson assigned Sarah as the convoy commander, with responsibility for coordinating the movement of 12 vehicles and 64 soldiers. It was a significant responsibility for someone with no combat experience, but Thompson had confidence in her training and judgment. "Mitchell," he said during the pre-mission briefing, "this is going to be your introduction to combat leadership. The convoy route has been hit 3 times in the past month, so there's a good chance you'll see some action. Remember everything you learned about tactical decision-making, but don't overthink things when events start moving quickly." The convoy departed Chapman at 06:00 hours, with Sarah's command vehicle positioned 3rd in the formation. The early morning air was cool and clear, providing excellent visibility across the rugged landscape. For the first hour, the mission proceeded exactly as planned, with the convoy making good time along a paved road that showed minimal signs of recent insurgent activity. Sarah monitored multiple radio frequencies simultaneously, coordinating with helicopter support, communicating with the vehicles in her convoy, and maintaining contact with the Tactical Operations Center at Chapman. The amount of information flowing through her headset was overwhelming at first, but her training had prepared her to process multiple inputs while maintaining situational awareness of the developing tactical situation. The attack came without warning at 0847 hours. Sarah's first indication of trouble was the sight of a massive explosion about 200 meters ahead of her vehicle, followed immediately by the distinctive crack of small arms fire coming from multiple directions. The lead vehicle in her convoy had struck an improvised explosive device, and insurgents positioned in the hills on both sides of the road were engaging the convoy with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. "Contact left. Contact right," came the voice of the gunner in the lead vehicle. "We've got multiple shooters in the hills." Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline unlike anything she had experienced during training exercises. This was real combat, with real bullets flying in her direction and real soldiers depending on her decisions for their survival. Everything she had learned about tactical leadership would be tested in the next few minutes. "All stations, this is Viper 6, she said into her radio, using her call sign to address the entire convoy. "We are taking effective fire from elevated positions on both sides of the road. First and second vehicles establish a base of fire to suppress enemy positions. Third through sixth vehicles move forward to provide aid to the lead vehicle. 7th through 12th vehicles establish rear security and prepare for possible enemy reinforcement." The convoy responded to Sarah's orders with the precision of soldiers who had been training for exactly this scenario for months. Machine gunners in the turrets of their armored vehicles began engaging enemy positions with sustained bursts of automatic fire, while other soldiers dismounted to establish defensive positions along the road. But the situation was more complex than a typical training exercise. The improvised explosive device had disabled the convoy's lead vehicle, leaving 3 soldiers wounded and trapped in a vehicle that was taking direct fire from insurgent positions. Sarah had to coordinate a rescue operation while maintaining the security of the entire convoy and preventing insurgents from overrunning their position. Viper 2-1, this is Viper 6. She called to the sergeant commanding her second vehicle. Can you get eyes on the casualties in the lead vehicle? Viper 6, this is 2-1. I can see the vehicle, but it's taking heavy fire from the hillside. We're going to need smoke and suppressive fire to get to them safely. Sarah made a series of rapid decisions that would determine whether her soldiers lived or died. She called for helicopter gunships to engage the insurgent positions in the hills while directing her vehicles to lay down suppressing fire that would allow a rescue team to reach the disabled vehicle. At the same time, she had to maintain communication with her superiors at Chapman and coordinate with the Tactical Operations Center to ensure that reinforcements would be available if the situation deteriorated further. The rescue operation took 23 minutes that felt like hours. Under cover of smoke grenades and machine gun fire, a team of soldiers led by Staff Sergeant Kim reached the disabled vehicle and evacuated the wounded to vehicles that could transport them to medical care. The insurgents continued firing throughout the operation, but Sarah's coordination of suppressive fire prevented them from achieving accurate shots at the rescue team. When helicopter gunships arrived on scene, they quickly identified and engaged the insurgent positions, forcing the attackers to withdraw deeper into the mountains. Sarah's convoy was able to continue their mission, but not before she had received her first real education in combat leadership. The wounded soldiers all survived their injuries, thanks in large part to the quick and effective response Sarah had coordinated under fire. But she knew that success in one engagement didn't make her a combat veteran. It simply meant she had passed her first test and earned the right to face more challenging situations in the future. Over the following weeks, Sarah's company conducted dozens of convoy operations, each one presenting unique challenges and dangers. She learned to read the subtle signs that indicated potential ambush sites, to coordinate with air support during complex tactical situations, and to make life-and-death decisions with incomplete information and no time for second-guessing. More importantly, she discovered that combat leadership required different skills than peacetime leadership. In garrison, she could take time to build consensus and incorporate input from her subordinates. In combat, decisions had to be made quickly and communicated clearly with no room for doubt or hesitation. Her soldiers needed to know that she could think clearly under pressure and that her orders would help them accomplish their mission while bringing everyone home safely. The transformation in her soldiers' attitudes was gradual but unmistakable. They began seeking her input on tactical problems, asking for her opinion about enemy activity patterns, and demonstrating the kind of confidence in her leadership that could only come from shared experience under fire. She was no longer the inexperienced officer who needed to prove herself. She was a combat leader whose judgment had been tested and found reliable. The defining moment of Sarah's deployment came during her 4th month in Afghanistan, when her company was assigned to conduct a complex operation in support of a larger counterinsurgency campaign. Intelligence sources had identified a high-value target operating from a compound in a remote valley, and Sarah's company was tasked with establishing an outer security perimeter while Special Operations Forces conducted the actual capture mission. The operation required her company to deploy to multiple positions around the target area, coordinating with aircraft and artillery to ensure that insurgents could not escape or receive reinforcement during the raid. Sarah would be responsible for commanding nearly 200 soldiers spread across 6 different locations, maintaining communications with multiple higher headquarters, and adapting to changing conditions as the operation developed. Captain Thompson had been selected for promotion and transfer, leaving Sarah as the acting company commander for the operation. It was an enormous responsibility for a captain with only 4 months of combat experience, but Thompson had confidence in her ability to handle the complex coordination requirements. "Mitchell," he said during their final planning session, "this is the kind of operation that makes or breaks military careers. If everything goes according to plan, it'll be a routine night. If things go sideways, you'll need to make decisions that could affect the outcome of the entire mission. The operation began at 2200 hours on a moonless night that provided excellent concealment for the approaching Special Operations Forces. Sarah established her command post on a hilltop that offered good visibility of the target area while remaining far enough away to avoid direct involvement in the actual raid. From her position, she could monitor the radio frequencies of all friendly forces while maintaining visual contact with her deployed platoons. For the first 2 hours, everything proceeded exactly as planned. Sarah's soldiers established their security positions without detection, while the Special Operations team moved into position around the target compound. Communications were clear, coordination was smooth, and intelligence indicated that the high-value target was present at the location. But at 0034 hours, everything changed. The Special Operations team's approach to the target compound was detected by insurgent sentries, leading to a firefight that immediately escalated beyond the scope of the original plan. Within minutes, Sarah was receiving reports of heavy enemy resistance, casualties among the raiding force, and the possibility that the high-value target was attempting to escape through routes that had not been anticipated during the planning process. Sabre 6, this is Viper 6, Sarah said into her radio, using the call sign for the Special Operations Commander. What is your current situation and how can we assist? Viper 6, we are taking heavy fire from multiple positions within the compound. We have 2 wounded and need immediate evacuation support. Also be advised that we have unconfirmed reports of vehicles leaving the target area heading north toward your Alpha Team position. Sarah processed this information quickly while studying her map and considering her options. The Special Operations team needed her support, but she also had to prevent the high-value target from escaping through her security perimeter. Her decisions in the next few minutes would determine whether the mission succeeded or failed. Roger, Sabre 6. I am repositioning Alpha Team to intercept vehicles moving north from the target area. Bravo Team will move to support your extraction, and Charlie Team will establish a casualty collection point for your wounded. What followed was the most complex tactical coordination Sarah had ever attempted. She repositioned her soldiers to respond to the changing situation while maintaining security around the entire target area. She coordinated with helicopter pilots to provide close air support for the embattled Special Operations team. She established communications with medical evacuation aircraft and guided them to secure landing zones where wounded soldiers could receive immediate treatment. Throughout the operation, Sarah remained calm and focused, making decisions based on her training and experience, while adapting to circumstances that no training exercise had ever replicated. Her soldiers responded to her orders with the confidence of troops who trusted their commander's judgment completely. The operation concluded successfully at 0347 hours, with the high-value target captured and all friendly forces safely extracted from the area. Sarah's coordination had been instrumental in the mission's success, earning recognition from both the Special Operations Commander and her higher headquarters. But more importantly, the operation had demonstrated something that would define the rest of Sarah's military career. Under the most challenging circumstances imaginable, leading soldiers in combat operations where lives hung in the balance, she had proven herself to be exactly the kind of leader the Army needed, someone who could think clearly under pressure, coordinate complex operations effectively, and earn the trust of the soldiers whose lives depended on her decisions. As she prepared to rotate back to the United States after completing her deployment, Sarah reflected on how much she had changed during her time in Afghanistan. She had arrived as a promising young officer, with excellent training and unlimited potential. She was returning as a combat-tested leader whose competence had been proven under the most demanding circumstances the military could provide. The war had taught her that effective leadership wasn't about gender, age, or background. It was about character, competence, and the ability to inspire confidence in people facing life-and-death situations. She had learned that lesson not in a classroom or during a training exercise, but in the mountains of Afghanistan, where her decisions had real consequences, and her soldiers' lives depended on her ability to lead them safely through dangers that would test the limits of human courage and endurance. Colonel Sarah Mitchell walked through the corridors of the Pentagon with the measured stride of someone who had earned every step of her journey to this moment. 15 years had passed since that nervous young woman first entered a military recruitment office, and now she wore the silver eagles of a full colonel on her uniform collar. Today would mark the culmination of everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed, and everything she had proven about leadership and service. The Secretary of Defense had personally requested her presence at a high-level briefing about military readiness and force structure. It was the kind of meeting that shaped policy for the entire Department of Defense, where decisions were made that would affect thousands of soldiers serving around the world. Sarah's expertise in combat operations and personnel management had earned her a seat at this table, but she knew that her presence also represented something larger: the changing face of military leadership in America. The conference room was filled with some of the most senior military officers in the country, generals and admirals who had spent decades climbing the ranks, each one representing years of experience and proven competence in their respective fields. As Sarah took her assigned seat, she noticed several curious glances from officers who knew her reputation but had never worked with her directly. General Patricia Hayes, the Army Chief of Staff, called the meeting to order and began discussing the challenges facing military recruitment and retention. The data was sobering. Recruiting numbers were down across all branches, experienced officers were leaving at alarming rates, and public confidence in military institutions was declining. The discussion quickly focused on leadership development and the need to identify and promote officers who could inspire confidence both within the military and among the civilian population. "We're facing a crisis of trust," General Hayes explained to the assembled officers. "Young Americans are choosing not to serve, experienced soldiers are choosing not to stay, and the public is questioning our effectiveness as military leaders. We need to take a hard look at how we develop leaders and what qualities we should be emphasizing as we shape the future of our armed forces." The conversation that followed touched on many of the issues Sarah had grappled with throughout her career. Questions about adapting traditional military culture to changing social expectations. Discussions about balancing operational effectiveness with personnel welfare. Debates about how to maintain military readiness while attracting and retaining the best possible officers from an increasingly diverse population. Sarah listened carefully to the various perspectives being shared around the table. These were intelligent, experienced officers who genuinely cared about the future of the military, but many of their proposed solutions focused on technical fixes rather than fundamental changes in how the military thought about leadership development. When General Hayes asked for additional input, Sarah decided to share her perspective based on 15 years of leading soldiers in peace and war. "General Hayes, if I may," Sarah began, her voice carrying the confidence that came from extensive combat experience and proven success in multiple leadership positions. "I think we're approaching this challenge from the wrong angle. We're talking about leadership development as if it's primarily a matter of training programs and promotion criteria, but I believe the real issue is much more fundamental." The room fell silent as Sarah continued her analysis. "Throughout my career, I've served under commanders who were technically competent but couldn't inspire trust from their soldiers. I've also served alongside officers who had all the right credentials on paper but couldn't make effective decisions under pressure. The best leaders I've known, and the best leaders I've tried to become, share certain characteristics that have nothing to do with their backgrounds and everything to do with their character." General Hayes leaned forward, clearly interested in Sarah's perspective. "Can you elaborate on those characteristics?" Sarah had spent years thinking about this question, refining her understanding through experiences that ranged from managing supply operations in garrison to coordinating complex combat operations in Afghanistan. "The best leaders understand that their authority comes not from their rank, but from their ability to earn the trust and respect of the people they lead," she said. "They listen more than they speak. They admit their mistakes quickly and learn from them, and they make decisions based on what's best for their soldiers and their mission rather than what's best for their own careers." She paused, looking around the room at the faces of officers who had spent decades navigating the complexities of military hierarchy and bureaucracy. "More importantly, the best leaders understand that true strength comes from surrounding yourself with people who are smarter, more experienced, and more capable than you are in specific areas. They're not threatened by subordinates who challenge their assumptions or offer alternative approaches to problems. They create environments where everyone contributes their best ideas and efforts toward accomplishing shared objectives." Admiral James Parker, the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs, nodded thoughtfully. "Those are admirable qualities, Colonel Mitchell. But how do we systematically develop those characteristics in our officer corps? How do we identify and promote officers who possess that kind of leadership potential?" It was exactly the question Sarah had hoped someone would ask. "Admiral, I believe we need to fundamentally change how we evaluate and develop military leaders," she replied. "Instead of focusing primarily on individual achievement and technical competence, we should be emphasizing collaborative leadership and the ability to bring out the best in other people. Instead of promoting officers based mainly on their performance in staff positions, we should be placing more weight on their effectiveness in leading soldiers." Sarah drew on examples from her own experience to illustrate her points. "When I was a company commander in Afghanistan, my most effective platoon leaders weren't necessarily the ones with the highest test scores from officer candidate school. They were the ones who could earn the trust of experienced sergeants who could make good decisions under extreme pressure and who could inspire soldiers to perform beyond their own expectations. Those qualities became apparent only through extended observation in challenging leadership situations. The discussion that followed was one of the most substantive conversations about military leadership that Sarah had ever participated in. Officers shared experiences from their own careers, analyzed successful and unsuccessful leadership approaches, and debated how military institutions could better identify and develop the kinds of leaders who would be needed for future challenges. As the meeting continued, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this room. She remembered the skepticism she had faced as a young lieutenant, the challenges of proving herself in her first combat deployment, and the satisfaction of watching soldiers under her command develop into effective leaders themselves. But she also remembered the moment that had defined her understanding of true leadership, a moment that occurred not during a major operation or significant crisis, but during a routine inspection at her second command assignment. She had been serving as a battalion executive officer at Fort Bragg, responsible for coordinating the activities of nearly 600 soldiers across multiple companies. The position involved enormous amounts of paperwork, countless meetings with higher headquarters, and the kind of administrative responsibilities that could easily consume all available time and energy. During a surprise inspection by the division commander, one of her company commanders had made a significant error that reflected poorly on the entire battalion. The mistake was serious enough to warrant disciplinary action and potentially affect the officer's future career prospects. As the executive officer, Sarah had the authority and responsibility to ensure that appropriate corrective measures were taken. But instead of simply processing the paperwork and moving on to the next crisis, Sarah had taken time to understand what had led to the error. She discovered that the company commander, Captain Lisa Rodriguez, had been struggling with personal issues that were affecting her professional performance. Rodriguez was a single mother whose child care arrangements had fallen through, leaving her exhausted and distracted during a critical period of preparation for the inspection. Rather than simply documenting the failure and recommending disciplinary action, Sarah worked with Rodriguez to develop solutions that addressed both the immediate problem and the underlying causes. She helped arrange alternative child care resources, adjusted work schedules to provide more flexibility, and established mentoring relationships that would help Rodriguez manage the competing demands of military service and single parenthood. The intervention worked. Rodriguez not only corrected the deficiencies that had led to the inspection failure, but went on to become one of the most effective company commanders in the division. More importantly, she became an advocate for other soldiers facing similar challenges, helping to create support systems that improved retention and performance across the entire unit. That experience had taught Sarah a crucial lesson about leadership. Technical competence and adherence to regulations were important, but the best leaders understood that their ultimate responsibility was to help the people under their command succeed. Sometimes that meant enforcing standards strictly, but sometimes it meant finding creative solutions to problems that traditional military approaches couldn't address effectively. The Pentagon meeting was winding down when General Hayes posed the question that would become legendary in military leadership circles. "Colonel Mitchell," the general said, "you've given us a lot to think about regarding leadership development and the future of our officer corps. But I'm curious about something more personal. You've obviously succeeded in a military culture that hasn't always been welcoming to women in leadership positions. What would you say to young women who are considering military careers but are concerned about the challenges they might face?" Sarah smiled, recognizing the opportunity to address not just the officers in the room, but the broader questions about diversity and inclusion that were shaping military policy debates. "General Hayes, I'd tell them that the military needs leaders who can bring different perspectives, different experiences, and different approaches to the challenges we face. Gender, race, and background are less important than character, competence, and commitment to service.
But I'd also tell them that they'll need to be prepared to prove themselves repeatedly, to earn trust through performance rather than expecting it to be granted automatically, and to find strength in their own convictions when others question their capabilities. She paused, thinking about all the women who had served before her and paved the way for her own opportunities.
Most importantly, I'd tell them that the military is changing, slowly but steadily, and that their service will help shape that change. Every woman who serves successfully creates opportunities for other women to follow. Every barrier that gets broken down makes it easier for the next person to walk through. That's not just true for women, it's true for anyone who doesn't fit the traditional military stereotype but has the qualities needed to serve effectively. The meeting concluded with General Hayes thanking all participants for their contributions to what had been an unusually substantive discussion about military leadership. As the officers began filing out of the conference room, several approached Sarah to continue the conversation privately. Lieutenant General Robert Morrison, a veteran of multiple combat deployments who commanded one of the Army's most prestigious divisions, stopped to shake Sarah's hand.
"Colonel Mitchell," he said, "that was one of the most insightful presentations on leadership I've heard in 30 years of service. I hope you'll consider applying for promotion to general officer. The Army needs leaders like you at the highest levels." Sarah thanked General Morrison for his encouragement, but she was thinking about something more immediate than her own career prospects. In 6 months, she would take command of a brigade, 3,000 soldiers who would depend on her leadership for their professional development, their mission success, and potentially their survival in combat. The promotion to brigade commander represented the culmination of 15 years of progressive leadership assignments, each one building on the lessons learned from previous experiences. She would be responsible not just for tactical operations, but for the welfare and development of soldiers whose own careers were just beginning. Some of those soldiers would be young women facing the same skepticism and challenges that Sarah had encountered as a lieutenant. Others would be experienced non-commissioned officers whose combat experience far exceeded her own. All of them would be evaluating her competence and character based on her actions rather than her credentials. As Sarah drove home from the Pentagon that evening, she reflected on how much had changed since that morning when she first walked into a military recruitment office. The nervous young woman who had worried about whether she could measure up to military standards had become a colonel whose advice was sought by the most senior leaders in the Department of Defense. But some things hadn't changed at all. She still felt the same sense of responsibility toward the soldiers she led, the same commitment to service that had originally motivated her to join the military, and the same determination to prove that leadership was about character and competence rather than conformity to traditional expectations. The phone call came 3 weeks later while Sarah was reviewing personnel files for her new brigade command. The voice on the other end belonged to Major Jennifer Walsh, the former college basketball player who had been one of Sarah's fellow candidates during officer candidate school. "Colonel Mitchell," Walsh said, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and nervousness, "I wanted to let you know that I just received orders to serve as your brigade executive officer. I can't think of anyone I'd rather work for." Sarah smiled at the news. Walsh had developed into an outstanding officer over the past 15 years, earning recognition for her service in Iraq and her innovative approaches to training and personnel management. Having her as executive officer would make the challenges of brigade command much more manageable. "That's outstanding news, Jennifer," Sarah replied. "I'm looking forward to working together again." "Ma'am," Walsh continued, "I also wanted to tell you something that you might not realize. When we were going through officer candidate school, there were times when I wasn't sure I could make it through the program. But watching you handle the challenges and the skepticism that some of our fellow candidates threw at you, that gave me the confidence to stick with it even when things got difficult." Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking about the responsibility that came with being a role model for other women in the military. "Jennifer, you succeeded because of your own determination and capabilities," she said finally. "But I'm glad if my example helped in some small way. Now we have the chance to do the same thing for the next generation of women officers." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, covering everything from operational plans to personnel challenges they would face in the new assignment. But as Sarah hung up the phone, she was thinking about something larger than tactical coordination or administrative responsibilities. 15 years after walking into that recruitment office, she had become the kind of leader she had hoped to become. Someone whose competence was recognized by peers and superiors,
whose character was trusted by subordinates, and whose service had opened doors for other women to follow. The journey had been challenging, sometimes frustrating, and occasionally dangerous. But it had also been profoundly rewarding in ways she could never have imagined as a young college graduate. 6 months later, Colonel Sarah Mitchell stood in front of her newly assigned brigade as they prepared for a deployment to Eastern Europe. 3,000 soldiers in formation, representing every branch of the military and every region of the United States. Young privates who had joined the Army to gain skills and experience. Experienced sergeants who formed the backbone of military operations. Junior officers who were learning to lead soldiers in increasingly complex operational environments. As she looked out at the faces of the men and women under her command, Sarah thought about all the challenges they would face together over the coming months. Training exercises that would test their technical proficiency and tactical coordination. Operational deployments that would require them to work effectively with allied forces from other nations. The constant pressure of maintaining readiness while supporting families and managing personal relationships across thousands of miles. But she also thought about the opportunities they would have to grow as soldiers and as leaders. The chance to prove themselves in demanding situations. The satisfaction of working as part of a team dedicated to missions larger than any individual contribution. The pride that came from serving something greater than personal interests or ambitions. Brigade, she called out in a voice that carried clearly across the formation. In 6 weeks, we deploy to conduct operations in support of our NATO allies. This will be a challenging deployment that will test everything we've trained for, and everything we believe about ourselves as soldiers. She paused, looking across the sea of faces that reflected the diversity of modern America. Some of you are wondering whether you're ready for this responsibility. Some of you are questioning whether you have what it takes to succeed in a demanding operational environment. Some of you are concerned about whether you'll measure up to the standards set by soldiers who have gone before you. Sarah smiled as she continued, remembering her own concerns during those early days of officer candidate school. I'm here to tell you that you are ready. You are prepared. You have trained extensively for this mission, and you will succeed because you are United States soldiers, members of the finest military force in the world. You will succeed because you will work together as a team, supporting each other and drawing strength from your shared commitment to excellence. She took a deep breath before delivering her final point. And you will succeed because leadership isn't about where you come from, or what you look like, or whether you fit someone else's expectations about what a soldier should be. Leadership is about character, competence, and the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult. Those qualities exist in this formation, and they will guide us through whatever challenges we face in the months ahead. As the formation was dismissed and soldiers began moving toward their next assignments, Sarah remained on the reviewing stand for a few additional moments. In a few hours, she would begin the intensive planning process that would prepare her brigade for deployment. There would be countless meetings, endless paperwork, and the constant pressure of ensuring that 3,000 soldiers were properly trained, equipped, and prepared for operations in a foreign country. But right now, standing in the afternoon sunshine and watching her soldiers move with the confident stride of professionals who knew their jobs and trusted their leaders, Colonel Sarah Mitchell allowed herself to feel the satisfaction that came from having answered every question about her capabilities through 15 years of distinguished service. The young woman who had once worried about whether she belonged in the military had become a colonel whose competence was unquestioned and whose leadership was respected throughout the Army. The journey had required her to prove herself repeatedly, to overcome skepticism and prejudice, and to find strength she didn't know she possessed. But it had also provided her with opportunities to serve her country, to develop as a leader, and to open doors for other women who would follow in her footsteps. As she walked toward her headquarters building to begin preparing for the deployment ahead, Sarah thought about all the soldiers whose careers would be shaped by the leadership they experienced over the coming months. Some would discover that military service was their calling, while others would complete their obligations and move on to civilian careers. But all of them would carry with them the lessons they learned about teamwork, dedication, and the importance of serving something greater than themselves. That evening, as Sarah worked late in her office reviewing operational plans and personnel files, her aide knocked on the door to inform her that a delegation of junior officers was requesting to speak with her. The group was led by Second Lieutenant Amanda Chen, a recent graduate of West Point, who had been assigned to the brigade just 3 weeks earlier. "Colonel Mitchell," Lieutenant Chen said as the group entered her office. We wanted to thank you for your comments during today's formation. For some of us, this will be our first deployment, and we were feeling nervous about whether we could live up to the standards expected of us. Sarah gestured for the officers to take seats around the conference table in her office. Lieutenant Chen, nervousness before a first deployment is normal and healthy, she said. It means you understand the responsibility you're accepting and you're committed to performing at your best. Ma'am, said Lieutenant David Kim, whose father had served as one of Sarah's squad leaders during her first assignment as a platoon leader. Some of us have been wondering about your experiences as a junior officer. What advice would you give to someone who's worried about earning the respect of experienced soldiers? Yeah! Sarah smiled, recognizing the same concerns she had felt 15 years earlier. The same advice I received from experienced non-commissioned officers when I was a lieutenant, she replied. Listen more than you speak. Admit when you don't know something rather than trying to bluff your way through. Make decisions based on what's best for your soldiers and your mission, not what's best for your own career. And remember that respect is earned through consistent demonstration of competence and character, not granted automatically because of your rank. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with the junior officers asking questions about everything from tactical decision-making to personnel management. Sarah found herself sharing stories from her own early experiences, including some of the mistakes she had made and the lessons she had learned from them. As the meeting concluded, Lieutenant Chen asked one final question. Colonel Mitchell, if someone challenges your authority or questions whether you belong in a leadership position, how do you respond? Sarah thought for a moment before answering, drawing on 15 years of experience in situations exactly like the one Lieutenant Chen was describing. Lieutenant Chen, when someone challenges your authority, you have two choices. You can spend your energy trying to prove them wrong, or you can spend your energy proving yourself right. The first approach focuses on your critics and usually makes the situation worse. The second approach focuses on your mission and your soldiers, and it's almost always more effective. She leaned forward, making sure she had the attention of everyone in the room. When someone questions whether you belong in a leadership position, the answer isn't found in arguments or explanations. The answer is found in your performance. Do your job well, take care of your soldiers, accomplish your missions, and let your results speak for themselves. People who are committed to finding fault will always find reasons to criticize, but people who are committed to mission success will recognize competent leadership when they see it. As the junior officers left her office, Sarah returned to her work preparing for the upcoming deployment. But she was also thinking about the conversation that had just concluded and the responsibility she felt toward the young officers who were beginning their own military careers. 15 years ago, she had been in their position, uncertain about her abilities, worried about acceptance, determined to prove herself worthy of the trust placed in her. Now she was in a position to provide the kind of mentorship and guidance that had been so crucial during her own development as a leader. The cycle was complete, but it was also continuing. Each generation of military leaders learned from those who had gone before, contributed their own experiences and perspectives, and prepared the next generation to face challenges that couldn't be fully anticipated. Sarah's service had opened doors for other women, but those women would face their own unique challenges and would need to prove themselves through their own performance and character. As she worked late into the evening reviewing operational plans and thinking about the deployment ahead, Colonel Sarah Mitchell reflected on the question that had started her military journey 15 years earlier. A skeptical drill instructor had asked whether she thought officer candidate school was summer camp, whether she believed the military was a place to make friends and share feelings. At the time, she had responded with the crisp, "No, drill sergeant." That was expected from candidates. But now, with 15 years of experience and the wisdom that came from leading soldiers in peace and war, she understood that the question had revealed a fundamental misunderstanding about what military service really involved. The military wasn't summer camp, and it certainly wasn't a place for casual friendships and emotional sharing. But it was a place where people formed bonds stronger than family, where they learned to trust their lives to each other's competence and dedication, and where they discovered that their individual strengths could be multiplied exponentially when combined with the efforts of others working toward shared objectives. The military was a place where people discovered what they were capable of when everything they believed about themselves was tested under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. It was a place where character was revealed, competence was proven, and leadership was forged in the crucible of responsibility for other people's lives and welfare. Most importantly, it was a place where the question, "Who's your commander?" could be answered with pride, confidence, and the knowledge that authority had been earned through service, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to the principles that made military leadership both necessary and honorable. Colonel Sarah Mitchell had become someone worthy of that answer. And in the months and years ahead, she would continue proving that effective leadership transcended every boundary except those imposed by character, competence, and dedication to service.